Greetings, friends and fellow freelancers. Welcome back to another episode of Tabletop Mercenary. This week I want to talk about an aspect of the profession that we often overlook because it doesn't really have anything to do with the actual hands-on nuts and bolts designing of mechanics and story and world building, but it's one of the more social aspects that, much like sales, we tend to overlook, we tend to not think about it, but it is one of the bigger ways you get opportunities and that you move up in the field. And to illustrate how networking can benefit you and why it's so important, I figured I'd share a couple of stories from my own career and sort of illustrate the point, I hope. Not just how important it is, but how randomly these connections can sometimes happen. So, while you don't need to have watched the previous installment about how I got to be where I am as a TTRPG designer, it would help, and this might fill in a couple of the blanks for those who are wondering what I left out of that last video. But for starters, we're going to rewind the clock all the way back to when yours truly had not only not gotten any professional writing credits, but we're going to go back to when I was still in high school and I was still gaming with a couple of friends of mine. I lied. Not high school. I was in early college at this point, but still. Point remains, I had not gotten into the industry. I did not have any professional credits. This is just a fun little fluke that really illustrated to me how important networking is when it comes to finding opportunities and getting yourself through the door so that you can do the job. But what had happened for this particular tale is I and my regular gaming group at this point in time had gotten together, and our game master really wanted to run a Star Wars game. He had a huge hard-on for Star Wars right now, largely because he'd been playing Knights of the Old Republic nonstop. And he just tried to persuade us into doing this thing he wanted to try. And the rest of us were really not huge Star Wars fans. We'd of course seen the films and we knew enough about the world and the stories to follow what he was talking about, but we weren't feeling anything too mystical. We really weren't all in on Jedi as character concepts. So we compromised. We told him we would show up in this world with the understanding and the caveat that he didn't expect any of us to be Force users, and we really didn't want to get caught up in the whole mystical side of that plot. And that was the agreement that we had. Give a session or so, we're getting into it, we're feeling out our characters, everything's going pretty good, and our game master comes to us and says, hey, he met this guy at work who's one of the security guards, and he can't make the regular sessions, but he wanted to try something a little different. See, this guy had experience in the military, and now he retired and is working private security to pay the bills and fill his time. And he is a huge Star Wars fan. But since he works all the time and he can't make our regular sessions, he wanted to be our villain. And we all thought that was really interesting, partially because we knew our game master and he really wasn't a tactical genius. And we liked the idea of having a mysterious somebody conducting the actions of the villains in between sessions, sort of feeding our GM what they should be doing from a smart tactical position. And so we go half a dozen sessions and we start getting wind of this mysterious villain who's controlling all the plots. We don't really know what's happening. And unfortunately, as with many other games that folks have run in late high school and early college, schedules changed, things happened, ideas got dropped, and we mostly forgot about it. But the game was relatively fresh in our minds at this point. So that's the first part of the story. This is where the networking part comes in. So it's about 2 weeks since our last session, and we've had to postpone things and put things on the back burner for a while, and I myself am looking for a new job. My last one kind of ran out the clock, and now I need something new to make money. So I go up a town or two over to the security office, which happens to be the same security office that runs the guards that take care of our game master's place of work. And so I go in, got my button-down shirt on, I got my slacks on, I fill out the job application, and I'm very yes ma'am, no sir sort of thing. And I hand it in, and me and another friend of mine from the table are up there, and we're like, okay, I did my thing, you drove me up here, let's go get lunch, we'll call it a day, go home, and I'll wait for a call. We're just about to step out the front door when the secretary sticks her head out and says, hey, do you have a moment for an interview? This is unexpected for me, so I'm like, yes, of course I do. So I walk in, they lead me back into the very large office of what appears to be at least one of the heads of the company. Is this big boulder of a man sitting behind his desk, fingers steepled, crew cut, very high-necked shirt. He shakes my hand, and then gives me my hand back because he's got a crushing grip. And, he starts asking me all the usual questions you'd expect from an interview. It's, what's your availability like? Do you want to do armed or unarmed? What's your schedule like? What are you studying in school? All those things. And we get to the end of the interview, and he sort of leans back and gives me one of those unreadable expressions. And he says, like, hey, do you know a guy named Bob? And I'm like, ah, crap. Because this never goes well when someone asks me a question like that. But I want to be honest, and I don't want to do anything to jeopardize how well things seem to be going. I just tell him, yes, sir, I do know him. And he gets this little smirk at the corner of his mouth as, so what'd you all think of that ambush at the starport? Because our game master had not mentioned that the individual who was playing our villain was the head of hiring at the security company, who occasionally filled in when they didn't have guards to take the spaces at his place of work. So unbeknownst to me, I had been, running counter operations against the individual who just offered me a job as I walked in the door because he recognized my name and had heard stories about what we were doing at the table that he couldn't make. And that, in addition to being one of my favorite stories about how gaming is in fact good for your profession and you should all do it and meet as many people as possible, kind of illustrates the random turns that networking can take when it comes to where you end up going with things in the publishing industry. However, I do have two other stories that I feel are kind of important that illustrate other things we should keep in mind when it comes to networking in this sphere. Another thing that has happened is for folks who have enjoyed my audio dramas, both the ones that I have made and the ones that my stories have been turned into, you might have heard of the YouTube channel of Ox in the Void. I highly recommend it, especially if you are a Warhammer 40k fan or just a general dark sci-fi fan. They've got all sorts of cool stuff on it. The channel is currently edging around 100,000 subscribers, so go subscribe if you haven't. But years ago at this point, I had just put together a fun little Space Marine fan story. It was about a World Eater, for those who are curious. And Waking Dogs was just a thing I threw together, hoping like, hey, maybe some folks will read this, they'll enjoy it. And I was really hoping that folks who did read it and did enjoy it would then go check out my recently published sci-fi novel, Old Soldiers, which deals with a lot of similar themes, and I figured if people enjoyed the short thing, maybe they'd be willing to drop a couple of dollars on this bigger book now that they're familiar with my writing style and they know that I make a thing they like. And I was just browsing Reddit looking for places to share this story, and I came across an individual that I'd never seen before, and he was looking for stories to dramatize, particularly from the Warhammer 40k setting. And so I said, and he's like, hey, I saw your post, here's a story of mine if it's something that you think you would like to do. And that was, Paul Graham, the fellow behind of Ox in the Void, that at the time I met him, his channel had, I want to say it was 4,000 to 6,000 subscribers. So from where I am, pretty impressive, but for YouTube standards, really not all that big. And he did a version of my story, and folks seemed to really like it, and he and I sort of built a working relationship off of that, and now I'm a regular featured on his channel to the point where he'll come to me and he'll say, hey, I really want to do a story for X, Y, or Z thing, whether it's I want something for this faction, or I think it would be cool to do something from this universe, can you get me a fan story for it? And so we've sort of got a really good back and forth working rapport, and as his career has gone up and his channel has got more popular, I've been kind of able to ride along with that momentum and help him get larger, and then he often returns the favor to me, helping me promote stuff or making sure that people see my work or know my name. And again, that was just a random connection I made browsing a subreddit that I can't even remember which one it was. It was not one of the major 40k subreddits, I can tell you that. And that was just a chance encounter online for folks who were worried that you had to be in person for things like this. And the last story. And this was, again, just a random moment in my day that happened to lead to something more of. I was at either WindyCon or Capricorn in Chicago. They're two relatively small sci-fi fantasy conventions. And I was on a panel with a bunch of other professionals, and we were talking about our work and how we got into the industry and what sort of things that we did for an audience who was wondering, how do we get jobs? How do we get our work published? All those usual questions that you find at conventions. And I do not remember everybody who was on the panel with me, but there was a, very nice older woman sitting next to me named Joy Ward, whom I had never met before. And we're talking about our various books and our various stories. And one of the regular books that she had published was I suppose you'd call it a modern fantasy setting where, we follow around, dogs that I cannot remember if they were talking dogs or if they were dogs whose inner monologue we just heard, like you'd see in Homeward Bound. And these had been some of her more popular reads, and she was just using them as an example for things that you could do to cater to an audience. And I had mentioned at that time that I was working on my hard-boiled cat novels. Now there are 2 of them out there, and this story is part of the reason why. And we go through the panel and whatnot, and then as we're all breaking up and exchanging cards and saying how nice it was to meet everybody, Joy turns to me and says, like, "Hey, I really like that book you were talking about. Is it available?" I'm like, "Well, it's not published yet." And she just nodded and is like, "No, I didn't mean available to buy. I meant, has anyone published it yet? I want it." And that was sort of a shock for me because I knew academically, because we'd done our introductions, that Joy, worked for a publishing company. She was an editor, and she was also someone who worked with acquisitions. So just being in the right place at the right time and talking about my work in a way that interested someone basically allowed me to skip the submissions line and go straight to a editor who wanted to see my book and wanted to take that pitch directly to the publisher and be like, "Hey, I think this is a book we should publish. You should definitely check this guy out." And I told you all 3 of those stories to make a point here, and that's that it doesn't matter at the end of the day how skilled you are, how talented you are, how much work you put out, if you don't have a robust network of connections that allows you to get your work from your desk out to the public. Theoretically, you could publish things yourself, but even then, when it comes to promotion, when it comes to finding an audience, when it comes to getting eyes on your work, you usually can't do that all on your own. This is, while it's a profession we often think of as sort of a solo journey, it's the writer alone in their room creating, whatever the thing is. You're either creating an RPG, or you're writing a novel, or you're doing articles, or you're making videos talking to a camera in a room by yourself. None of us can succeed on our own. We all need to have a network of people to help support us, and we need to have those connections that allow us to really build momentum and to get from where we are to where we want to be. And it's important to remember that networking, quote unquote, is not just something that happens in a specific space. It is something that happens everywhere you are. It does not matter what's going on. It does not matter the type of event you're at. There's always a chance that you meet a person that could come in handy later on, and not necessarily just publishers, just editors, just people in the field. They might be people who just have influence somehow, some way, that can be an opportunity for you. And while that sounds extraordinarily mercenary, don't forget what channel you're on. But it's important to not think of it always in terms of serious business. It's important to think of it in terms of, you never know who you're talking to, and you never know what they'll be able to do, what doors they could open or close. So it pays off to be polite, to be useful, to be interesting, and to just be as positive as you can, so that if it turns out someone you meet could help you out, their first reaction is, "Oh yeah, I remember that guy. He was nice. I'm going to do him a favor." It doesn't matter if you meet someone at a convention. It doesn't matter if you meet someone in your private life. It doesn't matter if it's just someone you're related to. For all you know, you might go back to your class reunion and find out that, someone you were friends with in high school that you lost touch with has become, the lead acquisitions editor at a major publisher. It might turn out that that guy your aunt is marrying is an editor who could help you out with something. You might meet someone randomly at a convention that, thinks your book is interesting and hands you a business card when you're done giving your spiel, and they run a podcast with several 100,000 listeners that are now going to find out that your book exists and that you're cool. Networking is tough. But I have found that the best thing you can do is to put yourself in situations where you get to meet people, and you get to meet people under circumstances where you're allowed to both talk about your work and to show off who you are and what you do, but to also just be engaging, be fun, be friendly. If you can pull all of those things off, sooner or later you will find connections in the weirdest of places. But before we conclude today's video, I want to add a couple of caveats and a little bit of advice. And this is a thing that I have seen from other authors, and I will acknowledge I made this mistake myself a couple of times when I was younger. And it's that even if you're going to an event, you're going to a convention, a get-together, some variety of professional event, where there's going to be people there who could open doors for you, who could assist you in your career, don't go in planning to give people the hard sell. And this is a thing that lots of us can be confused by because we think networking, a lot of us think, parties from 80s business movies where everyone's wearing power suits and doing cocaine in the bathroom and all those sorts of weird things. It's better to go in and just meet people, introduce yourself, be friendly, let conversations develop organically than it is to go into someone with like the hard handshake and the extended business card, because that is going to leave an impression, but it's not going to be the impression that you want. Allowing people to get to know the real you, to be more relaxed, be professional, but don't be all professional, if that makes sense. It's also important when you're planning on doing networking to be genuine. The last thing that you want is to give people an impression of someone that you can't live up to, or to make promises that are really outside your ability to deliver on. A lot of us are aware that business as a whole is made up of half-truths and things that we wish were true. But don't write checks that you can't cash is the advice that I would give. And lastly, if you reach any sort of position where you have the ability to act as a hub, where you have contacts and you have people that don't have contacts in your life, don't be stingy with them. This is a thing that I do my very best to do, having been a reporter and now having been an RPG creator. I try to be that mysterious NPC who can give everyone the quest hooks that they need to get them where they need to go. Whether it's I meet someone who has a book they're having trouble getting published, I will give them an in with folks I know who might like it. If someone has a game idea but they're missing people for it, I will try to recommend writers that I know, even if I don't have time for it, who could be their freelancers, who could help them bring it to reality. If I meet folks who have a product but don't have art, I've gotten to the point where I can give them a couple of names and a couple of email addresses and tell them who to reach out to. The more your network grows, the better off you are. And as we saw with people like Vox in the Void, just because they're small now doesn't mean they're going to be small forever. So if you can give someone that hand up to give them that opportunity to become larger, to grow, to become more prominent, they're going to remember you as the person who helped them out when nobody else would open the door for them. And that might be seen as a little selfish, a little Machiavellian, but it also has the benefit that you increase your network of people, and that is not something you can overlook when it comes to importance in your career. The more people you know, the more people you help and who can help you, the more community you have. And at the end of the day, that's really what networking is it's a community of people that you have met at least semi-organically who have developed a relationship with you. And that is just as important for being successful in publishing at any level as your skill, your talent, your vision, your ideas, because people want to work with those who do right by them, who help them, who are a delight to work with. It's probably better off to be reliable, to be personable, to be helpful, to be professional, than it is to be a genius who is difficult to work with. But that's all for this week's installment. If folks have any networking tips, things that have worked for them, leave them in the comments below. And if you have any stories about things that worked really well or which didn't work for you at all, leave those too. We need a couple of things to keep us going, and a good laugh always helps. But as always, like, subscribe, share the video around if you were particularly interested by anything I covered this week. And if you have a topic you'd like to see covered in the near future, don't hesitate to let me know. But until next time, this is your Tabletop Mercenary, signing off. First and foremost, thank you for staying to the end of this episode of Tabletop Mercenary. If there's a question you have about being an RPG creator, please don't hesitate to put it in the comments below so I can address it in a future episode. If you want to help me keep the lights on and keep this show going, then please consider subscribing to the channel, liking the video, and giving it a share on your own social media pages to help boost the signal. Lastly, if you really enjoyed this episode, please consider leaving a tip by buying me a Ko-fi or becoming a Patreon patron at the links in the video description below. You'll find me on both sites under the name The Literary Mercenary.